In this video, a guideline about Pu'er storage so that you can improve the taste of your tea and avoid the classical storage mistakes. Hi guys, this is Gabriele from nannuoshan, where we share the pleasure of drinking and discovering genuine farm tea. If you are also looking to expand your tea knowledge and brewing skills, then make sure to click on the subscribe button and don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Today we are going to speak about Pu'er storage. We already spoken in another video about tea storage in general, but in this one we really want to focus about Pu'er for several reasons. First of all, Pu'er is the classical tea that is stored and is aging over time, and also usually Pu'er is not kept in pouches that are sealed, but is wrapped into some paper like this one here, for example, and the paper is not completely sealed basically, so it breathes, you have air that flows through the paper and affect the tea over time. So now, first of all, before we deepen into the different main aspects of Pu'er storage to analyze how they affect actually the taste of the tea, how affect the storage, and so that you can choose the type of storage and for each different aspect that you would like, so that you can achieve the taste that you want of your tea in the future. Let's first of all distinguish between dry and wet storage. This is the classical distinction in the Pu'er world. Whenever you hear and start reading about the Pu'er storage, very soon you will end up reading about dry and wet. So what does it mean, dry storage and wet storage? To start really with the very basic. Well, as the words say, wet storage, it means that actually the tea was stored in a place with high humidity and moisture. Classic example of wet storage are Hong Kong, but also Malaysia, sometimes Taiwan, and even Guangdong in some cases. And then you have the classic dry storage. Dry storage is exactly the opposite. You store your tea in a dry, low humidity environment. And classic example are in China, would be in the north of China, like in Beijing, or also in Kunming, and in many other places in the Western world. So this is just to distinguish dry and wet, so that is clear in your mind, and we will look later about humidity more in detail. And now let's speak, as you know, about the different kind of Pu'er that we have. We have Sheng Pu'er and we have Shu Pu'er. Well, of course, aging affects both, but it does affect more Sheng Pu'er. Well, I have to say that actually dry storage doesn't affect that much Shu Pu'er, while wet storage, if it's particularly wet, it can really change a lot also Shu Pu'er. But when you usually read and speak about aging together with Pu'er, you actually focus on Sheng Pu'er, and this is also what we're mainly focusing today. I will mention though if there is some effect also on Shu Pu'er. Now, when we say storage and we say aging, what we mean? What happens when you keep the tea there for a while? There are two main things that actually happen to your cake. One, the leaves, the material of the leaves, the molecules in the leaves, have chemical reaction over time. They mutate because they react with other molecules already present in the leaves or coming from the outside, like oxygen. For example, oxidation is a classic chemical process that happens to your leaves. But you can also have microbiotic, I would say, types of aging, where you have bacteria and other form of life, or kind of like fungi that affect your tea. That could be, for example, fermentation is a classical example. Now, when we want to look at the different aspects that during the time affect the taste of your tea, we can start actually speaking about ventilation. And there are different theories about that. So ventilation means how often you change the air that comes in contact with your cake. You can keep your cake in a segregated room or even in a sealed bag. You have your wrap in a sealed bag, and then is not ventilated very often, or you can keep it in a room that you ventilate every day, for example. Now, when speaking about ventilation, we have first to understand what does ventilation affect. As we said, ventilation is more air, so it's definitely affect the oxidation of the cake. More ventilation means more oxidation, even forced ventilation. If you use some fan, for example, towards the pu'er, would even really speed up much more oxidation. When there is absence of ventilation, what can happen is that the cake develop a kind of stale taste, like in a closet room, or even in a closet if you want. Another aspect is that ventilation tends to remove heat. So if you have in your cake some activities that produce heat, for example fermentation is known to be one, then by ventilating continuously your cake, you would lower down the heat of your cake and affect also the specific process, like in the case of fermentation. If you want to ventilate your cake, be aware, especially if you have a lot of cake, to ventilate them all. So if you have a cake that is further back on your shelf and you just ventilate for an hour every week your room, the air might not reach that cake that is down there. So you want also to change the position of your cake. And it's up to you, actually. There are two different opinions about that. There are people that say pu'er doesn't need ventilation at all, you can keep it sealed and that's fine. There are other people that really search ventilation and even have forced ventilation to improve and speed up the oxidation process and the aging. In my personal opinion, but that's just my personal opinion, I don't like stale odor, stale smell on my cake, so I like to ventilate the room in which I have my tea. I usually do it by just opening the window on a dry day, and I do that at least once a week or twice a week. I don't think that is necessary to use fan to exaggerate, if you want, the ventilation, to use forced ventilation and induce an aging. I'm okay with the natural development of the cake, but I say that's just my opinion. Now, having spoken about ventilation and also a little bit about odors is important. Why? Because as we say that in a closed room, your cake might achieve a kind of stale smell. The smell and the taste, the odor, of the cake might also change when the cake comes in contact with other type of odors. So be aware of keeping your cake far away from the kitchen. It's much more sensitive than a sealed bag of tea. It is a wrap, there is paper. Leaves love to absorb odor, so keep them apart from the kitchen, but also try to keep apart shoe pu'er from shen pu'er, because otherwise the shoe would strongly affect the taste of the shen pu'er over time. Even just putting them in two different cardboard boxes, as long as the cardboard itself doesn't have a smell, helps. You don't really have to put them in different rooms, just different shelf of your furniture, that would help as well, yeah, for sure. And then another aspect that we have to consider is actually illumination, light. So do you want to put your cake close to the window, maybe because you want to have more ventilation, or is better to put them in the back of the room, or even in a room without windows? Well, light affects many aspects, in fact, of the aging process. One of it is actually that light can start or even accelerate certain chemical reaction in a way that you can hard control and predict. Another aspect that, of course, as we know, especially sunlight, might drastically change and very quickly change the temperature of your cake. So if you put your cake under a window and it is illuminated with sunlight, might have a very strong temperature during some hours of the day, for example. I say if it is directly under the sun, and also, of course, the sun dries, so it would dry your cake even more. So I think that there is a general acceptance in the pu'er world that people say it's better to avoid light, and I definitely would go with that. I would put my tea far away from sunlight, never under the sunlight. Any other form of light is kind of okay, but as long as it's not directly under the sun, you have done already a good job, let's say. And then now is the time to speak about humidity. I already mentioned before wet and dry, but that is a little bit of a simplistic distinction, if you want. So first of all, we have to say that there is wet and wetter, if you want. So we mentioned before Hong Kong, but as you know, also in your apartment you might have different rooms that have different level of humidity, right? So you have rooms that are fairly dry, and you have other rooms maybe in the basement or underground that are more wet, especially if they are very close to soil. So in the same fashion, even in Hong Kong, which is a humid city, you might have locations that are more or less humid. So here is really important that you distinguish if it was wet because it's a wet city, or if it was wet because it was a particularly wet room in a wet place. So to distinguish that, you might also read about traditional storage in Hong Kong. That is, it's wet but not too wet. Traditional means that during the first year the cake have been put in a basement, usually with high humidity, but after a few years it have been taken out of that room, put upstairs and in rooms that are more ventilated and with lower humidity, and it has been then dry over several years. So during the first year, with increased humidity, they would push the initial stages of the aging, and then they would slow it down before they consume the tea. So you can find this definition. Just be aware of the difference between wet and wetter if you want. When we speak about dry, there is the usual tendency of defining dry up to 60–70% humidity. In some cases you might even find 80%, but I would argue that 80% is really a limit of dry storage, because actually most places, most cities on the earth have an average yearly humidity lower or at the maximum about 80%. So it would be very, very hard to find places on earth, including Hong Kong, with an average humidity above 80%. So to me, you should consider a place that has 80% humidity as a humid place, wet and not dry. But as said, it depends also on the specific condition that you use in your storage. We say usually we store our tea indoor, and we want to focus about home storage actually. And I forgot my tea, of course. About home storage. And if you keep your tea at home, you know that in summer when you use AC, air conditioning, the air at home is drier than outside. In the same fashion, for a different reason, in winter when you heat up your apartment, the humidity also goes down. I remember back in the day that my mom were used to put water container on the heating elements to just wetten the air in winter. So you affect a lot the temperature and the humidity indoors. So when you want to check which condition your teas are subjected to, just think about where they are indoor. Don't just look at the weather forecast or the climate data about the place you are living in. So this was about indoor, about humidity. And by the way, just to let you know what I'm drinking here, this is actually a Pu'er. It is from year 2000. They pretend it is a Bingdao. I very hardly doubt that it's Bingdao. First of all, because in year 2000, Bingdao was not famous and no one would really care about saving Bingdao over time. But I would say it is a tea that is fairly old, about 20 years old. It was stored in Guangdong, and Guangdong, which has a climate that is not too far off, very much different than Hong Kong, the two places are very close to each other, has a relatively humid place. But as said, sometimes you might find also here that it was wet storage in Guangzhou or dry storage in Guangzhou. So depending, even in the same place, you might have drier or wetter storage. And this is the cake, and basically it is fairly dark and kind of dull, the surface, and also the leaves are not very clearly separated from each other. They are there is also some traces here of something white. I cannot tell if it is the wrap that are remaining stuck on the leaves, or it is even some mildew or some fungi hard, some fermentation even, hard to tell. But this is actually a tea that was wet stored, or I mean, it's not super wet, so it's not, you don't see a lot of fermentation, a lot of fungi on it, but still it is fairly wet, and you can tell by the taste. It has a taste that is a little bit stale, dull, flat, very earthy and wet, yeah, in a way. It also some aroma, and it has not too bitter, but very astringent on the palate actually. Anyway, just to show you here an example of actually wet storage. I said not too wet, but definitely wet and not dry. Now, we have spoke about humidity, about ventilation and so on. Let's speak about temperature. So what does temperature affect? Temperature does also affect the chemical reaction. So I say there are certain reactions that are activated at a certain temperature, and the higher the temperature, the faster the reaction goes. It affects also certain macrobiological activities. So for example, fermentation requires a certain temperature to start and a certain temperature to maintain, and to have the enzymes that are active and the bacteria that are active. And nonetheless, although if you see in a way it impacts the aging maybe in a similar fashion, you would say, than humidity. The higher the humidity, the faster the reaction, the higher the temperature, the faster the reaction. They are two different things. So what I mean that hot and dry is not the same like cold and wet. We will speak more about temperature and humidity in a future more specialized video about aging of Pu'er, but just that you know, while high temperature might not be really detrimental for your cake, it speed up certainly the reaction, but might not be detrimental. Very high humidity could be detrimental if certain reaction, and in particular certain fermentation if you want, don't basically go out of control, and you can have really a lot of mildew and fungi developing on your cake. Now, while on a blue cheese that's healthy and good, that's not necessarily the case with the fungi that develop on your cake. So you want also, for healthy reason, to be aware of it. All right. It's not the end of the story. There are a few other aspects that I want to mention, and while temperature, in particular humidity, you will hear a lot about it, ventilation a bit less, but you might hear and read about people writing about it. There is another aspect of which I couldn't find a lot of information so far, and this is inertia. What do I mean with inertia? Inertia, if you want, is how quickly your cake reacts to changes in the environment. So for example, if I take my cake and I put it very quickly in a high temperature chamber and then out again, its temperature won't change much because I haven't given him the time to adapt to the temperature. It's like if you take a can of Coke and you put it in the fridge just for 3 seconds, it doesn't become cold, right? That's the inertia. And there are things that are more inert than other, so they require more time to change. This is particularly important when you have temperature variation and humidity variation over time. Will your cake be affected by those changes? It depends on its inertia. And the inertia of your cake depends, first of all, if it is a cake, so it has been pressed, or it is loose leaf. Loose leaf reacts much faster. And on top of that, a pressed cake can be pressed by stone relatively loosely, or pressed by machine and can be very, very tight. On top of that, you have a wrap, and a wrap has a certain permeability but still block a little bit of exchange with the environment. And you might have a 7 cake in a tongue with bamboo leaves around it that are usually treated, so are not very permeable. So you have a lot of barriers, and this means that actually your cake are not really affected by quick changes in temperature and humidity. You don't have to be afraid if during the day it rains, your cake won't absorb immediately the higher humidity in the air, so day and night variation, they won't be seen by your cake. Similarly, when you are in a cave that it has more or less the same temperature in summer and in winter, also for the cake, is not much affected by very quick variation. If the variation goes more in the direction of weeks or seasonal variation, then your cake might be affected. It's hard to say and predict how quickly your cake will adapt to a different environment. It would require a certain type of experiment that if you want to do it and you have the ability of controlling temperature and humidity, let me know in the comments below and I will explain you which experiment can you do to really quantify how quickly your cake change with humidity changes and temperature changes. So if you change the temperature from 20 to 30 degrees, how quickly your cake will change, and more importantly, humidity. Because temperature, the cake adapts relatively quickly to temperature, but to humidity is much more difficult. You have much more barrier to water than to temperature actually. So this said, is important really to focus on seasonal variation, in particular if they are high, in particular they are affected by air conditioning, heating. By the way, traditional storage in Hong Kong back in the 90s and in the 80s, they might not have used really AC a lot. So the temperature indoor might have well been not too far off from that one outside, while nowadays is different. Almost every household have air conditioning if they live in a hot place, heating for sure. So look at actually if you have really seasonal variation inside your house and not only outside. All right, having said that, we have spoken about ventilation, we've spoken about odor, we've spoken about light, we've spoken about humidity, we've spoken about temperature, difference between indoor and outdoor, inertia, short-term, daily and long-term seasonal variation of temperature and humidity. But now let's go back to humidity for a second. I told you before that Hong Kong is a classic wet storage location. So let's see how much the humidity is in Hong Kong. Well, the average early humidity in Hong Kong is 77%, fairly high. So if we keep that as a reference, let's have a look what happened in Kunming in Yunnan, that we said with respect to Hong Kong is known to be much drier. And Kunming has a humidity of 71%. So what? 77, 71 is just 6% difference. Is it really a big difference? It's not. I mean, it's hard to explain with just 6% different, being one location wet and the other dry storage. So let's have a look at Shanghai. Shanghai is also a place that is rather known for being relatively dry storage. And the humidity in Shanghai, the average early humidity is 79%. Is 80%, and 79, 80 is just the same, but it's basically higher than Hong Kong. And when people say that Hong Kong has a wet storage and no one really say that Shanghai has a wet storage, if the humidity in Shanghai is higher. If you go to Beijing, farther in the north, also famous for being dry storage, you have 57% humidity, so that makes sense. But the whole story, there is something wrong in that. And if you look, for example, here in the US, you have LA as an average humidity of 65%, while New York City 63. So very similar, 65, 63. You would expect a fairly dry storage from both, but actually what I wouldn't have expected is that in LA and in New York, the cake would store in a similar fashion. I would expect it different. And if we look in Europe, for example, let's start from Zurich, the place where I've been living from 10 years and I've been storing tea there for 10 years, and I can guarantee you it's a very dry storage. I kept my tea in a room that is actually not heated during winter, and I don't have AC at home, so very much was similar to the outside environment. I was ventilating very often, and the humidity in Zurich is 79%. Even higher than Hong Kong. And if we look at places like Rome, 75%, so very similar to Zurich, also fairly high. And in Berlin, where we have our storage, it is 69, a little bit lower than that. So as you see, with all these values, what I want to show you that something is not correct. When we speak about dry and wet storage, and we make the example of Hong Kong and Kunming, we put Shanghai in the dry, that doesn't fit very well to actually the average humidity that those places have over the year. So what's the deal here? What's the problem? Well, to know the answer to the problem, you have to wait the next video where I will make a dedicated investigation about wet and dry storage, because this question is something that I've asked myself. We did a lot of research on the topic and I want to share the findings with you. So just, if you're watching this video as it came out in the first day, you have to bear another 1 to 2 weeks, and then there will be a second video only about humidity, specific for Pu'er storage. Until then, continue brewing tea, and I will see you in that video. Bye bye guys. By the way, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and to subscribe our channel. Thanks a lot.